Brian McKinney is the Director of Energy Analysis at the Deep Carbon Reduction Team at JB&B. He has considerable expertise in providing modeling services and design support for a wide array of high-profile and high-performance buildings. With a strong background in energy analysis, daylight analysis, thermal comfort studies, and life cycle assessment, his career has arced toward a specialization in buildings that successfully integrate high performance in energy consumption, carbon emissions, occupant comfort, and client financial objectives. Since coming to JB&B, Brian's primary focus has been in starting and developing the energy modeling practice of the firm. Brian is a LEED accredited professional and an ASHRAE building engineer modeling professional, BEMP. Let's put our hands together and welcome Brian to the stage.
Hello. So today I'm going to talk from the perspective of a building professional who is working to promote climate resilient and energy efficient design in the built environment. And so I'm going to take a more practitioner's standpoint, but I think that you'll all find this interesting. So let's get into it. So first of all, let's start with how we need to update our assumptions. So when a client is coming to us and asking, should I replace this chiller? Should I replace this boiler? They are primarily going to be concerned with how this is going to affect their ROI, their payback, or their overall carbon goals and how they comply with local laws and standards. The issue here, though, is that the standard practice for assessing these sort of things relies on TMY3 weather files, or at best TMYX files. And from our previous presentations, you all know that these are already out of date today and are only going to become more out of date as time goes on. So if you're trying to make predictions about future energy use or costs, you want something that's more up to date. So if you look at these graphs up here, what you're looking at are 4 histograms that show the shift from a TMYX weather file to these future weather files. And you're looking at them for 4 different conditions. So there are 2 different climate scenarios, TMY 4.5 and TMY 8.5, with the 4.5 representing moderate climate change and the 8.5 representing a more extreme level of climate change. And you're looking at them over the course of 2 different timeframes, 2040 to 2060 and 2060 to 2080. And in all cases, the general direction of movement is clear. Dry bulb temperature is getting higher over time. All of those red shaded cells are shifted a little bit to the right to all of the blue graphs. And when this is true of dry bulb, it's also true of wet bulb, which is, in addition to incorporating overall differences in just heat in the air, also incorporates differences in moisture. And as we will see, as we really get into it, it turns out that the increase in moisture actually has a larger impact on cooling energy overall than even the increase in heat. But hold on to that little tidbit. We'll keep getting into it. So that's the first of the problems that I'm usually dealing with. It deals with typical operation. The second problem that I am typically dealing with is the fact that people who are designing buildings, people who are installing the equipment, are using design conditions that are also based on past weather data. So if you're in New York City, they will tell you to design to the 1% cooling condition, the 99.6% heating condition, but these are percentages based on past scenarios, not future-looking weather data. If you were to take these FTMY files that are being developed and apply those same percentages to them, you see that you end up with an increase in temperatures across the board. So with the dry bulb temperatures, if you're looking at a couple degrees increase, so instead of something in the 88 range, you might be looking at 92.5 to 94.5, depending on what global warming scenario and what time frame that you're looking at. And while this might seem like a relatively small-ish difference, what you're looking at really is difference between your cooling interior design condition at 75 and whatever your outdoor condition is. So it's the real delta that you care about. And there you're looking at something more like a 25 to 35% increase in the delta temperature. And once again, the same thing is happening to the wet bulb temperature overall, in which you're seeing a pretty significant delta, actually a larger delta than you're seeing for dry bulb. Now, wet bulb is a little messier. It's not exactly linearly related to losses or linearly related to energy use, since warmer air holds more moisture. So the easiest way to talk about this isn't to try and just like quantify how much more moisture is in the air, is really to look at the impact on an actual building. So that being said, we decided to look at the impact of all of these changes in weather on one of the projects that we were looking at. We think that this project represents a lot of what New York City is trying to promote, in that it's an electrified building. So the case study that we're looking at is a commercial high-rise office building in Midtown Manhattan. It's about 900,000 square feet. It's built to the current New York City Energy Code, curtain wall facade. What I really want to emphasize about the building, though, is the heating and cooling plant, because we'll see that this dramatically affects the way that it reacts to global warming scenarios. So in particular, this building is using 4-pipe air source heat pumps for both heating and cooling. And we think that that this is one of the most direct ways that you can go about electrifying buildings. It's one of the ways that a lot of our clients are picking, simply because you can buy the same piece of equipment and get your heating requirements and your cooling requirements out of it. Thus, it's pretty capital effective. Now, as a 4-pipe air source heat pump, it's gonna have like a highly efficient heating system, but note that it also has heat recovery built into it. Hold on to that little nugget. All of that's going to be relevant in like 2 or 3 slides. So what does this all mean for energy use? So if you look at the graphs right there, you will see that if you work from left to right, we are running this building in a typical TMYX weather file. If you look at the second and third graphs, you're looking at the 2040 to 2060 timeframe, with the second representing RCP 4.5 and the third representing RCP 8.5. And then for the two on the right, the fourth and fifth ones, you are looking at 2060 to 2080 with RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. And overall, we are showing an increase in energy consumption, something in the 4.5 to 6.5-ish% range. And you can decide whether or not you think that that is a pretty major or small increase. But one of the notable things is that in these highly efficient designs, the plug loads, the lighting, the receptacles end up making up a majority of energy use in the building. And so the percentage that is HVAC driven is just a bit smaller than it is in a lot of typical buildings today. So we can isolate, though, the portion that is associated with HVAC, and you can see that this increase in energy is being driven by cooling. And this is where I'm going to call back to the description I was giving you of the overall heating and cooling plant, because while this is, we think, very emblematic of the buildings that New York City is promoting, it is also very different from a lot of the buildings that exist in New York City. So with a 4-pipe air source heat pump system, this building is getting something like 3 times the efficiency of a typical gas or steam central plant system in terms of just the coefficient of performance of the equipment. But on top of that, we are seeing that through the energy recovery, the ability to take all the servers, all the things that are running all the time in the building and funnel that cooling load into your heating load, that 3x difference actually turns into something more like a 6x difference. So you have something that dramatically reduces heating energy overall. And at the same time, a lot of existing buildings today use water-cooled chillers rather than air source heat pumps, which incidentally are about twice as efficient at cooling as air source heat pumps are. So air source heat pumps have the emphasis of increasing cooling energy and dramatically reducing heating energy, all of which makes this an extremely cooling dominated building. So this is where I also would like to point out that this is very different than the example you saw in Carrie's slides. Carrie's buildings were more heating dominate, particularly the residential one. This one is more cooling dominate because of the specifics of the system. What you should take away from this is that your actual results will vary depending on the specifics of your system, the specifics of your climate. But like I said, this is typical of the buildings that we're working on right now. So we thought it provided a valuable case study. So I guess I just went a little bit over the takeaways. The overall difference in energy looks small. In this building, heating and cooling are about 15-ish% of total energy. Depending on your system, it might be a little bit lower, it might be a little bit higher, but in any modern building, we expect the biggest drivers of overall energy consumption to be plug loads. And so your deltas overall may look somewhat smaller than you might at first glance anticipate. This building is highly cooling dominant. When we looked at what was driving that, we found that that was largely moisture, which we'll get into a little bit later. But the cooling dominant nature of the building highly affects the way it reacts to future weather files. And other buildings, like I said, you would typically or often see different results. So now I'm going to talk about the things that are directly derivative of energy. These will go by pretty quickly because they're fairly self-explanatory, but it's worth saying. So using future weather files, if you have an increase in energy consumption, you're going to have a roughly equivalent increase in carbon emissions. So here I've condensed this down to 3 bar charts, with the second one representing 2040 to 2060, the third one representing 2060 to 2080, and that thin little blue line on the top is like the range in differences in values. And so if energy is going up by something like 4 to 6%, then you're going to have carbon going up by something in a similar range. Makes sense? Cost, we also expect to roughly track with carbon. I will also say take this one with a grain of salt because we have no idea what energy tariffs are going to look like in the future. You may switch to having like large peak demand charges in the winter. So just based on the likelihood that everything is going to change, we don't really know what tariffs are going to look like. And then for peak electrical demand, this one we would expect to see, particularly in this type of cooling dominant building, a somewhat larger increase in peak demand than we would see in energy, just because cooling is a larger percentage of your energy use at your time of peak demand in the middle of summer than it is on average over the course of the entire year. And so this we expect to go up by a little bit more. So let's get into the second issue. Let's return to the question of equipment sizing. So as I mentioned earlier, you can take those same percentiles that ASHRAE uses to define what they say your design conditions are and apply them to an FTMY file to see what that same methodology would yield in terms of overall equipment sizing. And as a way to try and figure out what does this mean for buildings that we're designing today. So let's start with the heating load because this one honestly is the least interesting. Once again, we're looking at timeframes. As you would expect, heating load goes down. Great, you can't do anything with that because your building needs to function the day it's built. You can't install less equipment because eventually you won't need the equipment. So great, can't really use it. Cooling is more interesting though. So here, And I'll get into the reasons why it's a little bit more interesting in a couple slides, but let's start with the sensible load. I showed you that the delta in overall dry bulb temperatures would go up something like 25 to 35%. However, the outside air temperature isn't the only thing that drives sensible load. In fact, it's likely more driven by your internal gains than it is by your exterior conditions. So overall, we would expect something like a 9 to 15-ish% increase in overall peak sensible load. Once again, it depends on which climate condition you design is appropriate for your design. However, well, this is the sensible load. The latent load is the real story here, because the latent load we would expect to go up by more like 75 to 130%, depending on your overall scenario that you pick. So this is a massive increase in peak moisture in the air and ends up being more of a driver of your demand increase than the increase in temperature. So great, that's very large. What does this actually mean? So we looked at what this would mean for a building. Using the ASHRAE design conditions, we had started with a 12-inch chilled water riser. So we wanted to look at the distribution network first, because you really don't want to go in after the fact and rip out your distribution network. There's not really any way to do that in any sort of cost-effective manner. So we started with the 12-inch riser. We looked at what would happen if we looked at the global warming scenarios. In 3 of them, we would need to upgrade this to a 14-inch riser, likely with some increased pumps sizes. And then in the most extreme one, the RCP 8.5, 2060 to 2080, it resulted in a 16-inch riser. So obviously very substantial increases. With the central plant, you have a few more options. So once again, we start with 14 air source heat pumps. Depending on which future scenario we selected, we would go with something between like 15 or 19 air source heat pumps in the future. With the central plant, there is always the possibility of adding capacity later. So rather than building all of your equipment up front, you do have the option to leave space somewhere in your building to add an air source heat pump as you need it and as the cooling loads have gone up with increasingly warm weather conditions. In New York City, that's extremely hard. It's very hard to go to a developer and say, hey, there's this really valuable space that you're renting out for, I don't know how many dollars per square foot. Why don't you leave that empty for some future condition? That's something that does not fly with any developer. So another thing that we've been looking at is the possibility of using load shedding so that we can get more with less equipment. The idea of instead building ice, and ice tanks, it turns out you can put in a lot more places than you can put air source heat pumps. This is a potential solution that we're looking into. The idea is that you use roughly the same amount of equipment, but you build ice at night when you have lower loads, and then you use it to shed that load in the middle of the day, thus being able to take care of this increased future weather load without actually allocating as much equipment space to doing so. So all this is to say, we're looking at creative solutions to take care of our clients' needs. But if you take one thing away from this, it's that you should be looking at future weather conditions when determining how to build out your systems and figuring out how to basically make predictions for your clients' future energy needs. If you walk away from this presentation with that, I will feel like I've succeeded. So hope you found this interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So that is the PDH request form and the presentation evaluation form. Please fill it out. We will leave these up, and we can go back to these at the end of the entire event if you missed any of them. Thank you very much for using the stairs to go upstairs and keep the side talking and the cell phones down. Do we have any questions from the audience regarding the last 2 presentations? Yes, let's get a speaker. Please Say your name and your affiliation.
Yeah, real quick, just that request for one of the other verifications. That's brought on the slide. Oh. Oh, he's saying that they're swapped on the slides. So, Jason, yeah, that one was Jason's presentation.
Okay, so during the break, we can go back to the one and we'll announce it later.
At the end of the event, one slide, all the sessions QR codes on it, and that's swap too, or no? If they're all up together, then it'll be up. Make sure you snap all the QRs at the end. Scott, you might want to mention that for the stream, because they can't hear me.
Go ahead, any question?
Hi, my name is Leonard Chung. I'm a student at Fordham University. I once upon a time was an engineering physics student, but those days are behind me. Now I'm doing an MS in IT. So unlike you, I'm not scrambling to fill out my forms. At most, I am an amateur. But I am engaged with the data work nowadays, and I am very concerned about what's going on in the news. It's my understanding that access to some emissions data is maybe not very much available from traditionally very reliable sources like the EPA or NOAA. And with the focus, especially now on gaining a contemporaneous picture rather than, I mean, scrambling back into any archives available of historical data, I just wanted to ask, I guess, both of the speakers here, what their perception is of the resilience, not only of your end product, but of your design strategy or your data pipelining, I guess.
I can start on that one. At least for the historical data, the ASHRAE technical committees have got all of that because they've been working with it. So they've downloaded that stuff locally. We are somewhat concerned with the stuff moving forward. You know, you were looking at the design conditions. Those are updated every 4 years and they're heavily reliant on public data. The one thing we've got going for us is that airplanes need that data too. So there is some security in that, you know, we just for the safety of that sort of traffic will continue to have access. But we're watching it really carefully because I think every 2 weeks the answer is shifting. So, you know, ask me again in a few months how we're looking. There are also international agencies. Canada's doing a lot of great work. Europe is doing a lot of great work on trying to start to fill some of those gaps.
Yeah, and I guess I would second most of those thoughts. The answer is I'm quite concerned. There's a lot of organizations that are looking into this, and if a couple organizations basically shut down and stop providing reliable information, we'll get the most reliable information we can from whoever's providing it. So I do think that other people will step in to fill the gap, but it's definitely a really great loss to have our main governmental agencies not providing the quality of data that we are used to receiving.
Yes, Christine?
I have a quick question. Insurance data. What are insurance companies using, and are they aligning with design data from our engineers? And if they're not, should they be?
They probably should be, and I don't have much specific expertise in the insurance industry. I'm not usually dealing with them on a regular basis, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But insurance companies are watching changing climate conditions very, very closely. In many areas of the country, you have properties becoming more and more difficult and more expensive to insure. You have insurance companies leaving locations of the country altogether. And so they are definitely watching this with whatever data that they can get their hands on. And I don't think that's going to change no matter what policy or government rules say.
Yeah. I would just second, I think insurance and banking are two industries that are looking at this probably more closely than any of the other industries. And so I think they're doing a good job, but as a result, I'm quite concerned about having buildings be insurable in the future.
Hold on, before that question, we have a question from the virtual audience. Thank you very much for chiming in. Mateo Cornin has the question, please reiterate why passive solar heat gain is becoming less viable in places like Oregon than in the present past.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is that as you shift into the future, you're getting generally warmer and probably more hot, humid weather files. And so when those passive strategies were designed for those sort of colder conditions, those just don't exist in the future weather file. The entire thing is shifting forward. So, when you saw the shapes on the psychometric charts, the passive ones are for those dry, cool conditions. And in those future weather files, you have very few hours that are falling into those buckets.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Arvind from Columbia University. You mentioned plenty of data about weather files and so on and so forth. And I was talking to Matthew also a little before we started the session. There's one more set of data that I feel like we all have access, we all should have access to, but we don't. I mean, every one of you, especially in the industry, are working on some of these fantastic buildings, which is spewing environmental data within itself every second. And yet, if I try to find out the data for a particular building or a particular class of buildings, it's not the easiest to get. We should technically be having open source data for at least some buildings for a whole long time series data in that sense, right? So I think we're missing an opportunity by not having that kind of data being collected and made freely available to essentially researchers like yourself and ourselves. So that is something that I feel like ASHRAE, because if you try to talk to an individual building owner or even the facilities in Columbia, it's not the easiest thing to get access to. But if we can do it as a community, I feel like this is something that'll be very useful. So just throwing it out there for everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. I hope that with, benchmarking requirements and building performance. I'm hoping that with benchmarking requirements and building performance standards, it might get better, but I wholeheartedly agree. I wish we had better access to that data.
So
Okay, we have, oh, no, sorry, Brian.
I will add, there is very, very high level data available for buildings in New York City because of their benchmarking requirements. But the more useful data is like hourly data on heating energy use, cooling energy use, all the specifics that will let us diagnose a building. That is not available basically anywhere, and no one wants to give us access to the information. So I wholeheartedly agree to you. I'm hopeful that these first steps we have taken towards requiring buildings to benchmark their energy use will lead into more requirements that they share more data. I think that would be a game changer for us. It's one of the main things I look for in general to basically understand if we're doing everything correctly when we're studying buildings. But you're absolutely right. That's one of the biggest gaps in the market.
Happy to help in anything.
Just kind of wanted to follow up to that. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Byros. I'm Northeast Advocacy Manager at Daikin. And wanted to sort of highlight call to action. On Monday morning on Governor's Island, there's actually a New York City Community Climate Data Forum. So if anyone else wants to continue the conversation and advocacy work there, that's going on. And then also, wanted to also kind of shout out, I'm co-leading a task force from Advanced Energy Group where, they structured this 90-day sprint and 12-month challenge. And so the 90-day sprint, I'm really grateful for both of your presentations because it's about highlighting successful examples of energy modeling. So thinking about other weather data was definitely part of that conversation. And then the 12-month challenge was to convene stakeholders in New York City to try and align on those sort of guidelines on what energy modeling might look like. So if anyone is interested in helping out those task force or wants to go to the event on Monday, but yeah, just wanted to share that and say thank you both for your presentations. They were great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. If we could just remember that when we're holding the microphones, to hold them closer so that, especially for the virtual audience, so that they can pick it up. We have another question from the virtual audience from Janice Means. She's retired, but she's from the Lawrence Technical Institute. Brian, you were referring to RCP approaches. How does your analysis change using the new SSP approaches now used by the IPCC and others?
To be honest, I'd have to dig into those approaches. I don't have much knowledge or background in the specifics of them, but now I'm curious about them.
So Janice, we'll get back to you on that. Very good. Any other questions?
One over here, Scott. Actually, we have two more from the crowd. One for Brian. A little bit more technical on your case study that you were presenting on, but just interested if there was a reason for using chilled water distribution and hot water distribution versus just condenser water loop distribution throughout the building to water source heat pumps, and if that was also a consideration, or if there was enough existing equipment throughout the building that you were kind of forced into that 4-pipe system.
We've found that we like 4-pipe systems. We've often found that they're a very efficient way of delivering the energy that we want to, mainly because of all of the heat recovery that's built into them. I do know that there is effectively heat recovery also built into common ambient loops, and we've definitely considered them in the past and looked at whether or not those would be an alternate solution. They definitely could be, but for our purposes, particularly since we are looking to use the air source heat pumps as a way to like bring heat into the building as like the root source of heat, we found that they're a pretty efficient like single piece of machine that can do it all for us, like do everything in the few pieces of machinery.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Fred Trueblood with Falcon Air. First of all, happy birthday, Carrie. I have a question, and ironically, my mom is from Syracuse, New York, so I love when you show Buffalo area statistics. So being from Oregon, I believe you live in Oregon now, there's been major heat waves, unusual heat waves the last 10, 20 years. And in Europe, a lot of parts of Europe do not have air conditioning, and they've dealt with significant temperature increases as well. Is there a statistic on projected increase of air conditioning systems worldwide, like an increase of 10%, 20% the next 20, 30 years? I'm just curious if there's data on that.
There is data that was in the ASHRAE presidential. Does anyone remember? I think it's tripling in the coming decades. I don't remember. It's an astounding number. Yeah.
Yeah, so there doesn't exist, and a lot of that is developing on other parts of the world. So it's mostly bringing them online with air conditioning and stuff. So it is a tremendous increase in energy use. Sorry, it is a tremendous increase in energy usage.
Yeah.
Yeah, so first of all, great presentation. This is a bit less of a question and more of a comment to the guy that asked about the data who wandered away, which is unfortunate. But if someone knows him, please pass this on. There is some data that's been collected from buildings, and I know this because I submitted some of my own data to this. It's the ASHRAE Global Occupant Behavior Database, which was put together by, at the time, MTG OBB, which is now TC 7.10. Yeah, weird esoteric ASHRAE stuff. So if you do want some data, check it out. There is some energy data in there. Obviously, it's focused on occupant behavior, but you get down to like hourly level data that you could start to compare to these energy models and integrate with these types of systems.
Great, thank you. Let's everybody give a hand to Carrie and Brian. Appreciate it.